They thought cornering the quiet substitute teacher and trying to humiliate her in the most degrading way possible would be just another victory in their long campaign of terrorizing staff members. Ryan Carter and his crew of entitled bullies had no idea that the soft-spoken woman in the conservative grey dress had spent 6 years as a Marine Corps combat instructor, specializing in close-quarters defensive tactics. When Ethan Miller reached for the hem of her dress, while Alex Wright filmed for social media, expecting to capture another teacher's breakdown, they triggered a response that would leave all 4 boys sobbing on the classroom floor in under 30 seconds. This is the story of how one substitute teacher's hidden past turned a moment of attempted assault into a lesson these privileged bullies would never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning fog was just beginning to lift over Springfield, Ohio, as Lisa Johnson navigated her weathered Toyota Corolla through the quiet suburban streets toward Maple Valley High School. The dashboard clock read 7:15 a.m., and despite having made this same drive to dozens of different schools over the past 3 years, she still felt that familiar flutter of nervous energy that came with walking into an unfamiliar environment. The call had come at 6 in the morning, jolting her from sleep with its urgent tone. Mrs. Wilson, the advanced biology teacher, was down with flu symptoms, and they desperately needed someone qualified to handle her honors classes for the day. At 29, Lisa had developed a routine for these sudden assignments. She kept a go bag, packed with lesson plan templates, basic supplies, and carefully chosen outfits that projected professional competence while remaining deliberately unremarkable. Today she had selected a knee-length grey dress paired with a navy blazer and sensible black flats. Her naturally blonde hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her makeup was minimal but polished. The goal was always the same: blend in, maintain order, follow the established curriculum, and survive the day without creating any memorable incidents that might prevent future bookings. Substitute teaching had never been Lisa's long-term career plan, but life had a way of redirecting even the most carefully laid strategies. 3 years ago, she had been Staff Sergeant Lisa Johnson of the United States Marine Corps, responsible for training new recruits in defensive tactics and crowd control procedures at Camp Pendleton. Her specialty had been close-quarters combat instruction, teaching young Marines how to neutralize threats in confined spaces where traditional weapons weren't practical or appropriate. The work had been demanding but deeply satisfying, combining her natural teaching instincts with skills she'd been developing since childhood. Her martial arts journey had begun at age 8, when her parents enrolled her in a local taekwondo school, hoping to build confidence in their shy daughter, who was struggling with playground bullies. What started as basic self-defense quickly evolved into a passion that would define her adolescence and young adulthood. By high school, she had earned black belts in 3 different disciplines and was competing nationally in mixed martial arts tournaments. College had brought new opportunities to study Krav Maga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, systems that emphasized practical application over traditional forms. The military had seemed like a natural progression, offering the chance to serve her country, while developing her combat skills to their highest potential. 6 years in the Marines had taught her things no civilian training could provide: how to read hostile situations before they escalated, how to remain calm under extreme pressure, and most importantly, how to neutralize threats with precisely calculated force that achieved maximum effect while minimizing lasting damage. She had served 2 deployments overseas, where these skills had saved lives, including her own. But military life had also taken its toll in ways that weren't immediately visible. The constant hypervigilance required in combat zones had followed. her back to civilian life, making it difficult to relax in crowded spaces or unfamiliar environments. Her sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that mixed memories of actual combat with anxiety about imagined threats. The transition assistance programs had been helpful to a point, but ultimately she had needed to find her own path back to a sense of normalcy and purpose. Teaching had emerged as an unexpected solution. Working with young people provided the same sense of service and protection that had drawn her to the military, but in an environment where her defensive skills hopefully would never be needed. The substitute position allowed her to help students and teachers while maintaining the flexibility to manage her ongoing adjustment to civilian life. Most days, her military background was invisible to everyone around her, which was exactly how she preferred it. Students didn't need to see their teachers as potential combatants, and she had learned from experience that revealing her military service often created more problems than it solved. Some people became uncomfortable around her, projecting assumptions about violence and aggression that had nothing to do with who she really was. Others wanted her to demonstrate techniques or share war stories that she preferred to keep private. The simplest approach was to present herself as just another teacher, allowing her actions, rather than her credentials, to speak for her competence. Maple Valley High School sat on a sprawling campus that spoke to the affluence of its district. The main building was a modern architectural blend of brick and glass, surrounded by athletic fields that rivaled those of many small colleges. The parking lot was filled with vehicles that cost more than most people's annual salaries, a clear indication of the economic demographics she would be dealing with. As she gathered her materials from the passenger seat, Lisa noticed the subtle but unmistakable signs of a school where money talked louder than merit. The immaculate landscaping, the lack of obvious security measures, and the general air of entitlement that seemed to emanate from the very buildings. Her teaching bag contained the usual supplies along with a few items that most substitutes wouldn't think to bring. A small digital recorder, officially for taking notes about lesson plans, but also useful for documenting any incidents that might require later clarification. A detailed notebook where she tracked student behavior patterns and administrative responses, information that had proven valuable when school districts called for references. Most importantly, a laminated card with emergency contact numbers and procedures, because she had learned that crisis situations required immediate access to proper channels rather than fumbling through unfamiliar bureaucracies. The main office buzzed with the controlled chaos typical of any high school morning. Students streamed past with backpacks and coffee cups, their conversations creating a steady hum of teenage energy and drama. Lisa approached the reception desk where a harried-looking secretary was juggling phone calls and paperwork with practiced efficiency. The woman glanced up with obvious relief when Lisa introduced herself as the substitute for Mrs. Wilson. "Thank goodness you're here," the secretary said, handing over a folder thick with lesson plans and administrative forms. "Mrs. Wilson called in around midnight, and we've been scrambling ever since. She teaches 5 sections of advanced biology, plus 1 AP prep class. The kids are generally good, but..." She paused meaningfully. "Well, let's just say, some of our more prominent families have children who can be challenging for substitute teachers." The warning was delivered with the diplomatic language that Lisa had learned to decode over her years in various schools. Translation: wealthy students who faced minimal consequences for inappropriate behavior, especially when the only authority figure was a temporary teacher with no institutional relationships or protection. She had encountered similar situations before and developed strategies for managing them, though success was never guaranteed when dealing with teenagers who knew they were essentially untouchable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The biology classroom was located in the newer wing of the building, accessible through hallways lined with trophy cases and academic achievement displays. Mrs. Wilson had clearly been teaching for many years, based on the carefully organized laboratory equipment and the detailed posters covering every available wall space. The lesson plans were thorough and well-structured, focusing on cellular respiration processes that would require a combination of lecture material and hands-on laboratory work. Lisa had enough science background to handle the content confidently, which always made these assignments more manageable. As she arranged materials and reviewed the day's schedule, Lisa noticed that the classroom offered several advantages from a tactical perspective. Multiple exits, clear sight lines to all student seating areas, and a teacher's desk positioned to maintain visual contact with the door and windows simultaneously. The laboratory section included potential hazards in the form of chemical supplies and gas burners, which meant she would need to maintain especially careful oversight during any practical work. Student safety was always the primary concern, but her military training had also taught her to automatically assess environmental factors that could become relevant in emergency situations. The first period bell rang at exactly 8 a.m. and students began filtering into the classroom with the casual confidence typical of advanced placement students. Most appeared genuinely focused on academics, carrying well-organized binders and settling quickly into their assigned seats. However, Lisa's attention was immediately drawn to a group of 4 boys who entered together with an entirely different energy. Their body language spoke of entitlement and casual disrespect, the kind of attitude that suggested they viewed substitute teachers as temporary obstacles rather than legitimate authority figures. The apparent leader was a tall, athletic senior with perfectly styled brown hair and designer clothes that probably cost more than Lisa's monthly rent. He surveyed the classroom like a predator evaluating territory, his gaze lingering on Lisa with obvious calculation. His companions formed a natural hierarchy around him. A muscular boy whose Letterman jacket marked him as a star athlete, a smaller student whose expensive phone and constant typing suggested social media influence, and a 4th boy whose nervous energy indicated he was probably the follower in their group dynamic. "Good morning, class," Lisa said, projecting the calm authority that had served her well in much more dangerous situations. "I'm Ms. Johnson, and I'll be covering for Mrs. Wilson today. I understand you're working on cellular respiration, and we have both lecture material and laboratory work planned." The majority of students responded with polite attention, but the 4 boys exchanged glances that clearly communicated their assessment of her as an easy target. The ringleader raised his hand with exaggerated formality. "Ms. Johnson, I'm Ryan Carter. My dad actually serves on the school board, so I just want you to know that we take our education very seriously here. I hope you're qualified to teach at our level." The comment was ostensibly respectful, but delivered with a tone that made it clear he was establishing dominance while creating plausible deniability for any complaints that might arise. Lisa recognized the tactic immediately, challenged the substitutes' credentials publicly, forcing them to either defend themselves and appear defensive or ignore the provocation and appear weak. Her response was calibrated to acknowledge his concern while redirecting focus to the lesson. "I appreciate your commitment to academic excellence, Ryan. Mrs. Wilson's lesson plans are very detailed, and I'm confident we'll cover everything she intended for today. Let's begin with the overview of aerobic cellular respiration." The initial probe had been deflected, but Lisa could see Ryan processing her response and planning his next move. His friend, the athlete, was flexing his hands in ways designed to draw attention to his physical size. The social media student had his phone positioned to potentially record interactions, while the 4th boy seemed to be watching for her reactions to their various pressure tactics. They were testing her boundaries systematically, which meant the real confrontation was still coming. Throughout the first period, the harassment remained subtle but persistent. Ryan asked increasingly complex questions designed to expose gaps in her knowledge, while his friends created minor disruptions that technically stayed within acceptable behavior guidelines. When Lisa handled the academic challenges competently, they shifted to personal comments about her age, her appearance, and her qualifications. Each incident was individually minor, but collectively they created an atmosphere of disrespect that made it difficult to maintain classroom focus. During the transition between first and second periods, Lisa noticed several students approaching her desk with genuine questions about the material, but they kept glancing nervously at Ryan's group. One girl, a petite brunette with worried eyes, lingered until the other students had left before speaking quietly. "Ms. Johnson, I'm Megan Taylor. I just wanted to say that Ryan and his friends aren't usually this intense with teachers. They seem to think substitute teachers are fair game for their games." The warning was delivered with obvious concern for Lisa's well-being, and it confirmed what she had already observed about the group's targeting pattern. "Thank you for letting me know, Megan. I've dealt with challenging students before. Is there anything specific I should be aware of?" But Megan just shook her head and hurried out as the second period students began arriving, clearly not wanting to be seen talking to the substitute about the popular boys. Second period brought a fresh group of students, but the same 4 troublemakers, who apparently had multiple classes with Mrs. Wilson throughout the day. This time, they entered with increased confidence, having tested Lisa's responses and apparently decided she was manageable. Ryan immediately challenged the seating chart, claiming he needed to sit closer to the front due to vision problems that were obviously fabricated. When Lisa politely declined to rearrange the established system, Ethan Miller, the athlete, made a show of dramatically squinting at the whiteboard and commenting loudly about how some substitutes just didn't care about student needs. The pattern continued through third and fourth periods, with each class bringing subtle escalations in their testing behavior. They questioned her instructions, demanded to see her teaching credentials, and made increasingly personal comments about her appearance and presumed inexperience. Lisa maintained professional composure throughout, but she was also carefully documenting their behavior patterns and escalation tactics in her notebook during brief moments between classes. By lunchtime, she had a clear picture of their strategy. Ryan was the strategic leader, planning psychological pressure campaigns designed to either break her composure or force her into overreactions that could be used against her. Ethan provided physical intimidation through proximity and size, while Alex Wright documented potential incidents on his phone for later use in creating whatever narrative served their purposes. Brandon Davis seemed to follow the others' lead, but was clearly invested in the outcome of their campaign against her authority. What none of them realized was that their behavior pattern was almost identical to psychological pressure tactics Lisa had encountered during her military service. Hostile forces often use similar approaches to test captured personnel, establish dominance through questioning authority, create stress through personal attacks, escalate pressure gradually, while maintaining plausible deniability, then push for a final confrontation designed to break their target's resistance completely. The main difference was that enemy combatants had usually been more sophisticated in their approaches than these privileged teenagers. During her lunch break, Lisa attempted to address the situation through proper administrative channels. She approached the main office with her documented observations and a request for guidance on handling the escalating behavior. The assistant principal, Mr. Rodriguez, listened politely, but his response was predictably disappointing. "Boys can be challenging sometimes, especially with substitute teachers," he said with practiced diplomacy. "Ryan Carter is actually one of our top students, and his family has been very supportive of our athletic programs. Are you sure there wasn't just some miscommunication about expectations?" The subtle message was unmistakable. Complaints against these particular students would not be taken seriously, especially from a temporary teacher who would be gone by tomorrow. The system was designed to protect students whose families had financial influence while leaving vulnerable staff members to manage difficult situations without institutional support. Lisa had encountered similar protective dynamics in other wealthy districts, but it was still frustrating to face the reality that she was essentially on her own for whatever these boys had planned for the afternoon. She spent the remainder of her lunch break reviewing the classroom layout and emergency procedures, preparing for what her instincts told her would be an escalation during the final periods of the day. The boys had been testing her responses systematically, and their confidence was growing with each successful provocation that went unchallenged by administration. Military experience had taught her that bullies, whether enemy soldiers or entitled teenagers, typically pushed toward a dramatic confrontation once they felt confident in their tactical superiority. The fifth period advanced biology class proceeded with the same pattern of subtle harassment, but Lisa noticed increased coordination between the four boys. They were communicating through glances and gestures, clearly planning something for the final class of the day. Alex Wright spent considerable time on his phone, probably alerting his social media followers to expect some kind of entertainment. Ethan Miller made increasingly obvious displays of his physical size and strength, stretching and flexing in ways designed to intimidate. Brandon Davis kept glancing toward the classroom door as if planning exit strategies or ensuring privacy, for whatever they intended. Most concerning was Ryan Carter's behavior, which had shifted from testing her academic knowledge to making increasingly personal comments about her appearance, her age, and her presumed personal life. "Ms. Johnson, you seem pretty young to be teaching high school," he said during a transition between lesson segments. "Do you have a boyfriend? Because someone as pretty as you probably has lots of options." The comment crossed clear professional boundaries while being delivered with enough apparent innocence to make formal complaints difficult. When the final bell rang for sixth period, Lisa felt the familiar pre-combat alertness that had served her well in genuinely dangerous situations. The four boys entered with barely contained excitement, their energy focused and predatory in ways that made other students uncomfortable. Several girls, including Megan Taylor, shot worried glances toward Lisa before taking their seats as far from the troublemakers as possible. The atmosphere in the room felt charged with anticipation, as if everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen. Today, we're going to finish our discussion of cellular respiration and begin preparing for next week's laboratory practical, Lisa announced, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the obvious tension. Please open your textbooks to Chapter 12 and review the diagrams of mitochondrial processes. But even as she spoke, she was tracking the boys' positions and behavior patterns, noting how they had arranged themselves strategically around the classroom. Ryan raised his hand with exaggerated politeness. "Ms. Johnson, I think there might be some confusion about what Mrs. Wilson actually wanted us to cover today. Are you sure you're following the right lesson plan? Because my father talked to Principal Anderson about maintaining academic standards, and we wouldn't want to fall behind because of substitutes who don't understand the curriculum." The challenge was more direct than previous attempts, designed to publicly question her competence while invoking his family's influence. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly recognizing the disrespectful tone, even if the words remained technically appropriate. Lisa's response was calm but firm, establishing clear boundaries without escalating the confrontation. "The lesson plans provided by Mrs. Wilson are very detailed, Ryan. We're exactly where we should be in the curriculum. Please open your textbook so we can continue." But Ryan wasn't finished with his challenge. "You know what, Ms. Johnson? I think you might be a little young and inexperienced for a school like ours. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at one of the public schools downtown where the standards aren't as high." The insult was delivered with a smile, but the intent was unmistakable. He was asserting his perceived social superiority while attacking her qualifications in front of the entire class. Ethan Miller joined the assault with his own contribution. "Yeah, plus you seem kind of nervous. Are you sure you can handle advanced students like us? Because we're used to teachers who really know their stuff." The comment was accompanied by an obvious display of his muscular build, using physical intimidation to reinforce the verbal pressure. Alex Wright had his phone out and was clearly recording the interaction, probably hoping to capture Lisa losing her composure for later social media entertainment. Brandon Davis moved closer to the front of the classroom, positioning himself to block her most direct path to the emergency. Call button mounted near the door. Their coordination was becoming obvious, and Lisa realized they were moving toward their planned finale. With about 10 minutes remaining in the class period, Ryan stood up without permission and walked toward the front of the classroom. "You know what, Miss Johnson? I think we need to have a more serious conversation about respect and standards." His tone had shifted from mock politeness to open hostility, and other students were beginning to look genuinely frightened by the change in atmosphere. "Please return to your seat, Ryan," Lisa said calmly, but she was also subtly adjusting her position to maintain optimal tactical positioning. Military training had taught her to always keep multiple exit routes available while maintaining visual contact with all potential threats. The classroom layout offered several advantages, but she was also outnumbered and dealing with opponents who clearly felt protected by their social status. "I don't think so," Ryan replied, moving even closer to her desk. "See, the problem is that substitutes like you come into our school thinking you can disrespect students like us. But maybe you need to learn how things really work around here." Ethan Miller moved to block the main door while Alex Wright continued recording. Brandon Davis positioned himself near the windows, completing their tactical encirclement. The threat was becoming explicit, and Lisa realized they had planned this confrontation carefully. They had isolated her from help, positioned themselves to control her movement options, and were recording everything to ensure they could control the narrative afterward. Most concerning was the predatory energy that was building in the room, suggesting they intended to escalate beyond verbal intimidation. "This conversation is over," Lisa said firmly, reaching for the emergency call button. But Ethan Miller moved quickly to block her access, using his size to physically intimidate without technically making contact. "Class dismissed," Ryan announced, with authority he didn't possess. "Everyone except us has somewhere else to be." The clear threat in his voice sent the remaining students scrambling for the exits, including Megan Taylor, who cast one last worried look toward Lisa before disappearing into the hallway. No, they were completely alone, exactly as the boys had planned. The isolation was complete, and Lisa realized she was facing a situation that had moved far beyond normal classroom management into something much more serious. "You know what your problem is, Ms. Johnson?" Ryan said, his mask of politeness finally dropping completely. "You think you can come into our school and disrespect us without consequences. But maybe it's time you learn to show some appreciation for who we really are." The threat was unmistakable, and Lisa felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that preceded combat situations. Ethan Miller stepped closer, using his physical presence to crowd her toward the corner where she would have fewer movement options. "Yeah, you seem pretty uptight. Maybe you need to relax a little and show us what you're really like under all those conservative clothes." Alex Wright adjusted his phone position to get a better angle, clearly expecting to record whatever humiliation they had planned. That's when Brandon Davis made the comment that revealed their true intentions. "Let's see if our substitute teacher is wearing anything interesting under that boring dress," he said with a predatory grin. The sexual nature of their threat was now explicit, and Lisa realized they intended to physically assault her while recording the incident for their own entertainment and her ultimate humiliation. When Ethan Miller reached toward the hem of her dress with obvious intent to lift it, while Alex Wright captured the moment on video, 6 years of Marine Corps combat training and 15 years of martial arts experience activated with devastating precision. The moment his fingers made contact with her clothing, Lisa's response was swift, controlled, and utterly decisive. In less than 30 seconds, 4 of the most privileged and protected students at Maple Valley High School learned that their substitute teacher was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined possible. The instant Ethan Miller's fingers made contact with the fabric of Lisa's dress, every instinct honed through 6 years of Marine Corps service and 15 years of martial arts training exploded into action. Her response was so swift and precise that the 4 boys didn't even comprehend what was happening until it was already over. Lisa's left hand snapped out to catch Ethan's wrist in an iron grip, her thumb finding the pressure point that would send lightning bolts of pain shooting up his arm. Simultaneously, her right elbow drove upward into his solar plexus with calculated force. Not enough to cause permanent damage, but sufficient to completely empty his lungs and drop him to his knees, gasping for breath. The entire movement took less than 2 seconds, and Ethan found himself immobilized on the classroom floor before his brain could process that the situation had completely reversed. "I am Staff Sergeant Lisa Johnson, United States Marine Corps," she announced in a voice that carried the absolute authority of someone accustomed to life and death command decisions. "You just committed sexual assault on a combat veteran, and every moment of it is being recorded on your friend's phone." Her grip on Ethan's wrist tightened slightly, causing him to whimper as the pressure point technique sent waves of agony through his nervous system. Ryan Carter's confident smirk evaporated instantly, replaced by shock and the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about power dynamics had just been shattered. Alex Wright's phone trembled in his hands as he realized that instead of capturing a teacher's humiliation, he had recorded evidence of their attempted sexual assault on someone who possessed the skills and legal authority to destroy their lives completely. "What the hell?" Brandon Davis stammered, backing toward the windows as he witnessed his friend reduced to a sobbing mess on the floor. "You can't just attack students like that. We'll have you arrested. My father will sue you for everything you're worth." But his voice cracked with fear as he spoke, because the woman standing over Ethan looked nothing like the meek substitute teacher they had been tormenting all day. Lisa's posture had transformed completely. Gone was the slightly nervous demeanor of someone trying to blend in and avoid confrontation. In its place stood a warrior whose body language radiated controlled lethality and absolute confidence. Her feet were positioned in a balanced fighting stance that would allow instant movement in any direction. Her hands remained relaxed but ready, and her eyes swept the classroom with tactical awareness that missed nothing. "Alex, hand me that phone," Lisa commanded, her voice carrying the tone of someone who expected immediate obedience. "The video you just recorded is evidence of attempted sexual assault, and it will be turned over to law enforcement exactly as it was filmed. No editing, no deletions, no convenient technical difficulties." When Alex hesitated, she applied slightly more pressure to Ethan's wrist, causing him to cry out in pain. "Please," Ethan gasped, tears streaming down his face as the pressure point technique continued to flood his nervous system with agony. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean anything. It was just supposed to be a joke. Please let me go." The arrogant athlete, who had been using his size to intimidate her moments earlier, was now reduced to begging for mercy from someone half his weight. A joke, Lisa repeated coldly, maintaining her grip while addressing the other three boys. Sexual assault is a joke to you. Recording someone's humiliation for social media entertainment is a joke. Systematically harassing teachers is a joke. Her voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it that promised serious consequences for anyone who tested her further. Ryan tried to regain control of the situation through bluster and implied threats. Look, this has gotten completely out of hand. You're going to be in serious trouble when Principal Anderson hears about this. My father sits on the school board, and we have connections throughout this district. If you let Ethan go right now, maybe we can work something out that doesn't ruin your career. Lisa's laugh was utterly without humor. Your connections don't impress me, Ryan. I faced down insurgents with actual weapons and real training. You're just spoiled children who've never encountered anyone willing to hold you accountable for your actions. She shifted her stance slightly, and all three remaining boys instinctively stepped backward, recognizing predatory movement even if they didn't understand the technical aspects of her positioning. Brandon, you mentioned your father suing me, Lisa continued conversationally while maintaining her control over Ethan, who had stopped struggling and was simply trying to breathe through the pain. Let me explain how that conversation will go. Your father's attorney will review the video evidence of you and your friends attempting to sexually assault a substitute teacher. Then they'll research my military service record and discover that I'm trained in exactly the defensive techniques I just used. Finally, they'll realize that any lawsuit will result in criminal charges against you and massive civil liability for your families. The legal reality of their situation was beginning to penetrate through the boys' shock and panic. They had planned this confrontation as another in their long series of consequence-free attacks on vulnerable staff members. Instead, they had provided video evidence of attempted sexual assault against someone with both the skills to defend herself and the legal knowledge to pursue every available remedy. Alex Wright's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his phone steady. "We weren't actually going to hurt her," he said desperately. "It was just supposed to scare her a little. You know, show her who runs things around here. We've done it before with other substitutes and nobody ever made a big deal about it." The admission hung in the air like a confession, revealing that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of abuse. "You've done this before," Lisa repeated, her voice taking on an even more dangerous edge. "How many other substitute teachers have you terrorized? How many women have you humiliated and traumatized for your entertainment?" Each question was delivered with surgical precision, designed to make them confront the full scope of their behavior rather than dismissing this as an isolated mistake. Ethan was now crying openly, the combination of physical pain and emotional shock having completely broken down his facade of teenage invincibility. "Please," he sobbed, "I can't feel my hand. You're really hurting me. I promise we'll never do anything like this again. Just please let me go." But Lisa maintained her grip, knowing that the moment she released him, the boys would likely revert to their default pattern of denial and blame shifting. "The pain you're experiencing is temporary and non-damaging," Lisa explained with clinical detachment. "It's a pressure point technique designed to control combative subjects without causing permanent injury. You'll have full function back within minutes after I release you. Unlike the psychological damage you've inflicted on your previous victims, which may last for years or even decades." Ryan's strategic mind was working frantically to find some way to salvage the situation and minimize the consequences his crew was facing. "Okay, look, maybe we got carried away today, but you have to understand, this is just how things work at schools like this. The families who support this institution expect their children to be treated with a certain level of respect. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding about boundaries. There's no misunderstanding about sexual assault Lisa replied firmly, and there's definitely no misunderstanding about using family wealth to avoid accountability for criminal behavior. She reached into her blazer pocket with her free hand and withdrew her phone, speed dialing a number while keeping her eyes fixed on the three standing boys. "Springfield Police Department, this is Detective Martinez," came the voice from her phone speaker, clear enough for everyone in the classroom to hear. The boys' faces went pale as they realized she had direct contact with law enforcement, something that contradicted their assumption that substitute teachers were powerless and friendless. "Detective, this is Lisa Johnson. I'm a substitute teacher at Maple Valley High School, and I need to report an attempted sexual assault that occurred in my classroom. I have 4 perpetrators in custody, along with video evidence of the incident. I'll also need someone from the district attorney's office who specializes in cases involving minors from prominent families." Her tone was businesslike and professional, the voice of someone who understood legal procedures and wasn't intimidated by wealth or social connections. The effect on the boys was immediate and devastating. Brandon Davis started hyperventilating as the reality of criminal charges and public exposure crashed down on him. Alex Wright dropped his phone, which clattered across the floor as his hands began shaking uncontrollably. Ryan's face cycled through a range of emotions, from disbelief to anger to fear, as he realized that all his family's influence might not be enough to protect him from the consequences of recorded criminal behavior. "No, wait," Ryan said desperately, his voice cracking with panic. "You can't call the police. This will ruin everything. Our college applications, our futures, our families' reputations. There has to be another way to handle this. We're sorry." "Okay, we're really, truly sorry. It won't happen again, we promise." Lisa looked at him with something approaching pity. "Now you're concerned about consequences and futures. Where was that concern when you were terrorizing other teachers? Where was that consideration for their careers and well-being when you were systematically driving them away from jobs they needed?" Her questions cut through his self-centered panic to expose the fundamental narcissism that had enabled their behavior. Detective Martinez's voice came through the phone again. "Miss Johnson, are you in immediate danger? Do you need patrol units to respond immediately?" The professional concern in his voice was clearly audible, and it reinforced the boys' growing realization that Lisa was not the helpless victim they had assumed her to be. "I have the situation under control, Detective," Lisa replied calmly. "The perpetrators are secured, and I have video evidence of the entire incident. However, I would appreciate having units respond to take statements and begin the formal investigation process. These individuals have apparently been engaging in this pattern of behavior for some time, and there may be additional victims who need to be contacted." The mention of additional victims sent fresh waves of panic through the boys as they contemplated the possibility of other teachers coming forward with their own accounts of harassment and abuse. Their systematic campaign of terrorizing substitute teachers was about to be exposed completely, along with whatever protection their families' wealth and influence had previously provided. Ethan's sobs had escalated to the point where he could barely speak coherently. "I'm sorry," he gasped between tears. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Please don't let this destroy my whole life. I have a scholarship to state. My parents will kill me if they find out about this. Please, there has to be something we can do to fix this." "You should have considered those consequences before you decided to assault a teacher," Lisa replied without sympathy. "Actions have results, and you're about to learn that wealth and privilege can't always protect you from accountability." But even as she spoke, she was evaluating the boys' emotional states and considering whether there might be educational value in allowing them to experience genuine remorse before the legal system took over. Alex Wright had retrieved his phone and was staring at the recorded video with horror. "This is going to be everywhere," he whispered. "Once this gets out, everyone will know what we did. My social media career is over. My college prospects are finished. My parents are going to disown me." The irony of his social media platform becoming the instrument of his own destruction was not lost on anyone in the room. Brandon Davis was hyperventilating so severely that Lisa began to worry he might actually pass out. "I can't breathe," he gasped. "This can't be happening. My father is running for city council. If this comes out, it will destroy his campaign and our family's reputation in the community. There has to be some way to keep this quiet. Please, we'll do anything." "Anything," Lisa repeated thoughtfully, still maintaining her grip on Ethan's wrist while considering their desperate offers. "Would you have done anything to prevent this situation? Would you have done anything to avoid traumatizing your previous victims? Or are you only interested in making deals now that you're facing consequences for your actions?" Ryan tried one more time to assert some form of control over the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Look, Ms. Johnson, you're obviously more capable than we realized. We clearly made a serious mistake in judgment today, but think about what happens next. Criminal charges will drag everyone through a lengthy legal process. The media attention will be intense. Your own military background will be scrutinized. Is that really what you want?" Lisa's expression hardened at his obvious attempt to threaten her with exposure and public scrutiny. "Are you suggesting that a combat veteran should be ashamed of her service record? Are you implying that I should be intimidated by media attention because I've testified before congressional committees about military policies and I've faced down hostile interrogators in war zones? A few local reporters asking questions about a sexual assault case don't exactly keep me awake at night." The threat had backfired completely, serving only to remind everyone in the room that Lisa possessed resources and experience far beyond what the boys could comprehend or counter. Their usual tactics of intimidation and implied consequences were utterly ineffective against someone who had faced genuine dangers and emerged victorious. Detective Martinez's voice came through the phone again, providing an update on response times and procedures. "Ms. Johnson, I have units en route to your location. They should arrive within 10 minutes. I've also contacted the district attorney's office, and they're sending someone who specializes in cases involving minors. Can you maintain control of the situation until backup arrives?" "Absolutely, Detective," Lisa replied with confidence. "The perpetrators are secured and cooperative. I'll maintain custody until your officers can take over the investigation." Her military terminology and professional competence were clearly audible in every word, reinforcing the boys' growing understanding that they had chosen the wrong target for their predatory behavior. As sirens became audible in the distance, growing steadily louder as police units approached the school, the four boys experienced the full emotional collapse that comes with realizing that consequences are both inevitable and imminent. Their privileged world of protected misbehavior was about to collide with the reality of criminal justice, public exposure, and social accountability. Ethan's tears had progressed from pain and fear to genuine emotional breakdown as he contemplated the destruction of everything he had worked toward in his young life. Ryan's strategic mind was still frantically searching for escape routes that didn't exist. Alex Wright was documenting his own destruction through the very medium he had intended to use for Lisa's humiliation. Brandon Davis had progressed beyond hyperventilation to full panic attack as he realized that his family's political aspirations were about to become casualties of his criminal behavior. The transformation in the classroom was complete. Four boys who had entered with predatory confidence and apparent invulnerability were now reduced to sobbing, terrified children facing the consequences of behavior they had never imagined would be challenged effectively. The substitute teacher they had targeted for sexual assault and humiliation stood over them with the calm competence of someone who had faced far greater challenges and emerged victorious. In less than 30 seconds, Staff Sergeant Lisa Johnson had dismantled their entire worldview and demonstrated that real strength comes from discipline, training, and moral courage rather than inherited wealth and social protection. The lesson they were about to learn would extend far beyond this classroom and affect not only their own futures, but potentially reform an entire school culture that had enabled their predatory behavior. As the sirens grew louder and the reality of criminal investigation became undeniable, the boys realized that their reign of terror over substitute teachers and vulnerable staff members had come to a permanent end. The quiet woman in the conservative dress had proven to be far more dangerous than they could have imagined, and their attempt to record her humiliation had instead documented their own destruction. The heavy footsteps of police officers echoed through the hallways of Maple Valley High School as 3 patrol units converged on the biology classroom. Principal Anderson arrived first, his face flushed with exertion and concern as he burst through the door, followed immediately by 2 uniformed officers whose hands rested casually but meaningfully on their service weapons. What they found was a scene that defied every expectation they had formed during their rapid response to the school. Officer Rebecca Chen, a 12-year veteran with specialized training in domestic violence and sexual assault cases, surveyed the classroom with professional efficiency. In the center of the room, a composed woman in business attire maintained a controlled grip on a sobbing teenage boy whose athletic build was rendered meaningless by his obvious distress. 3 other boys cowered near the windows, their expensive clothing disheveled and their faces streaked with tears and panic. The contrast between the calm authority of the substitute teacher and the complete emotional breakdown of the students was so stark that Officer Chen initially wondered if she had responded to the wrong location. "I'm Officer Chen, Springfield Police Department," she announced, her voice carrying the controlled authority of someone trained to manage crisis situations. "We received a report of attempted sexual assault. Can someone explain what happened here?" Her partner, Officer Williams, positioned himself near the door while maintaining visual contact with all parties, following standard protocol for potentially volatile situations involving multiple subjects. Lisa released her grip on Ethan's wrist with deliberate care, allowing him to collapse fully to the floor, where he continued sobbing while clutching his hand to his chest. "Officer Chen, I'm Lisa Johnson, the substitute teacher who called for assistance. These 4 students cornered me in this classroom after dismissing the other students, then attempted to sexually assault me while recording the incident for what I assume was social media entertainment." Her report was delivered with military precision, each detail carefully articulated for maximum clarity and legal accuracy. Principal Anderson's face went through a rapid series of transformations as the implications of Lisa's statement penetrated his administrative mindset. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said automatically, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone of someone accustomed to managing delicate situations involving prominent families. "These are some of our most outstanding students. Ryan Carter's father serves on our school board, and Ethan Miller is being recruited by several Division I football programs. Surely this is just a case of teenage misbehavior that got out of hand." Officer Chen's expression hardened as she recognized the familiar pattern of institutional protection that often complicated investigations involving wealthy or influential suspects. "Principal Anderson, I'll need you to step back and allow us to conduct our investigation without interference. These are potentially serious criminal charges, and the students' academic or athletic achievements are irrelevant to the legal proceedings." Her tone left no room for negotiation or administrative maneuvering. Alex Wright, still clutching his phone with trembling hands, tried desperately to salvage something from the disaster unfolding around him. "Officer, there's been a huge misunderstanding. Here, we were just joking around with the substitute teacher, normal student stuff. She completely overreacted and attacked Ethan for no reason. Look at him, he's seriously injured. Shouldn't you be arresting her for assault?" His voice cracked with false confidence as he attempted to flip the narrative and cast himself and his friends as the victims. Officer Williams stepped forward, his imposing presence immediately silencing Alex's protests. "Son, I'm going to need you to hand over that phone immediately. If you recorded any part of this incident, that recording is now evidence in a criminal investigation. Any attempt to delete, edit, or otherwise tamper with that evidence will result in additional charges of obstruction of justice." His outstretched hand left no doubt that compliance was not optional. "I don't have to give you anything," Alex replied, with the entitled defiance of someone accustomed to adult authority figures yielding to his family's influence. "My father is a major contributor to the Police Benevolent Fund, and our family attorney will be here within the hour. You can't just take my personal property without a warrant." But his voice lacked conviction, and his hands shook as he spoke, betraying the fear that was overwhelming his attempted bravado. Detective Martinez arrived at that moment, his plainclothes appearance and obvious seniority immediately shifting the dynamic in the room. "I'm Detective Martinez, and I've been following this case since Ms. Johnson's initial call. Mr. Wright, your phone contains potential evidence of a felony sexual assault. I can obtain a warrant within 30 minutes, or you can cooperate voluntarily and potentially receive consideration for that cooperation during prosecution. The choice is entirely yours, but the phone will be secured either way." The arrival of detective-level personnel drove home the seriousness of the situation in ways that even Ryan Carter's strategic mind couldn't rationalize away. "Detective, I think there's been a serious escalation of what should have been handled internally by school administration," he said, falling back on the diplomatic language that had served his family well in previous crisis management situations. "My father has extensive experience in conflict resolution, and I'm sure he could work with Principal Anderson to find a solution that serves everyone's interests." Detective Martinez fixed Ryan with the steady gaze of someone who had interviewed countless suspects attempting to leverage family connections and social status. "Mr. Carter, attempted sexual assault is not an internal school matter. It's a criminal offense that will be investigated and prosecuted according to state law, regardless of your family's position in the community. Your father's conflict resolution experience is irrelevant to criminal proceedings." The detective's tone carried the finality of someone who had no patience for entitled behavior. Brandon Davis, who had been hyperventilating near the windows, finally found his voice through his panic attack. "This is insane," he gasped between rapid breaths. "We didn't actually assault anyone. We were just messing around, trying to embarrass her a little. It's not like we were going to seriously hurt her or anything. Can't you see this is all blown completely out of proportion?" His desperate attempt to minimize their actions only served to provide additional evidence of their intent and planning. Officer Chen approached Brandon with the professional demeanor of someone trained in crisis intervention. "Mr. Davis, I need you to sit down and focus on controlling your breathing. Panic attacks can be serious, and we want to make sure you're medically stable before we continue with statements." Her concern was genuine, but also strategically sound, ensuring that any statements he made would not be compromised by claims of medical distress or diminished capacity. Lisa stepped forward to address Detective Martinez directly, her military bearing evident in every aspect of her posture and communication style. Detective, I want to be clear about the sequence of events and the level of threat these students represented. They systematically isolated me from potential help, coordinated their positions to control my movement options, and explicitly stated their intention to sexually humiliate me while recording the incident. This was not spontaneous teenage misbehavior, but a planned assault with clear criminal intent. Her testimony was delivered with the precision of someone accustomed to providing critical information under pressure, and it immediately elevated the investigation from a potential misunderstanding to a serious criminal matter requiring thorough documentation and prosecution. Detective Martinez nodded as he took notes, recognizing the credibility that came with military training and experience. Ms. Johnson, can you walk me through your defensive response and explain the techniques you used to subdue the primary attacker? Detective Martinez's question was both professional and strategic, establishing the reasonableness of her actions while documenting her qualifications to assess threat levels accurately. I understand you have military background that may be relevant to evaluating the appropriateness of your response. I used a standard pressure point control technique taught in Marine Corps close quarters combat training, Lisa explained, with clinical precision. The specific technique targets nerve clusters in the wrist and forearm to cause temporary pain and compliance without permanent damage. It's designed to control combative subjects while minimizing injury risk, and it's completely reversible once pressure is released. Mr. Miller will have full function restored within minutes and no lasting effects. Ethan looked up from his position on the floor, his face streaked with tears and his voice hoarse from sobbing. "She nearly broke my wrist," he claimed desperately. "I think I need medical attention." This is way beyond reasonable self-defense. She could have just told us to back off instead of attacking me like some kind of trained killer. His attempt to cast Lisa as the aggressor fell flat, given his obvious physical superiority and the recorded evidence of his assault attempt. Officer Williams knelt beside Ethan to assess his claimed injuries, his examination thorough but unsympathetic. "Your wrist shows no signs of damage, bruising, or restricted movement," he reported to Detective Martinez. "The suspect is exhibiting normal range of motion and grip strength. Any pain experienced was temporary and consistent with non-damaging control techniques." His medical assessment effectively demolished Ethan's claims of excessive force. Principal Henderson made another attempt to assert administrative control over the rapidly expanding investigation. "Detective Martinez, I appreciate law enforcement's concerns, but I think we need to consider the broader implications of criminalizing what may have been poor judgment rather than malicious intent. These students have bright futures ahead of them, and a criminal record could destroy opportunities that benefit not just them, but our entire community." Detective Martinez's response was swift and uncompromising. "Principal Anderson, the district attorney's office will make prosecutorial decisions based on evidence and legal standards, not on the suspect's academic achievements or family connections. If you continue to interfere with this investigation, I'll have you removed from the scene and potentially charged with obstruction of justice. This is your only warning." The detective's authority was absolute, and Principal Anderson stepped back with obvious reluctance, realizing that his usual diplomatic approaches were powerless against criminal investigation procedures. His discomfort was palpable as he watched the systematic dismantling of the protective systems that had previously shielded privileged students from meaningful consequences. A new voice interrupted the tension as District Attorney Sarah Fletcher entered the classroom, her professional attire and confident demeanor immediately commanding attention from everyone present. "Detective Martinez, I came personally because cases involving minors from prominent families require careful handling to ensure both justice and proper procedure." What's the current status of your investigation? DA Fletcher, we have 4 suspects in custody for attempted sexual assault on a substitute teacher, Detective Martinez reported efficiently. We have video evidence recorded by one of the suspects, witness testimony from the victim who has military training in threat assessment, and physical evidence consistent with the reported assault attempt. The suspects have provided statements that corroborate the victim's account while attempting to minimize their culpability. DA Fletcher surveyed the scene with the analytical eye of someone who had prosecuted hundreds of similar cases. Ms. Johnson, I understand you're the victim in this case. Can you provide a brief summary of what occurred here today? Her request was both professional courtesy and strategic assessment, evaluating the credibility and composure of the key witness whose testimony would be central to any prosecution. Lisa's response was comprehensive yet concise, outlining the systematic harassment campaign that had built throughout the day, the coordinated isolation and intimidation tactics used by the 4 boys, and the explicit sexual assault attempt that had triggered her defensive response. Her military bearing and precise communication style clearly impressed DA Fletcher, who recognized the value of having a highly credible victim with professional training in threat assessment and crisis management. Based on what I'm hearing, we have clear evidence of conspiracy to commit sexual assault, attempted sexual assault, and potentially additional charges related to the harassment campaign and abuse of authority, DA Fletcher announced to the room. Mr. Wright, that phone will be secured immediately. Officers, please place all 4 suspects under arrest and read them their rights. We'll be proceeding with formal charges. The announcement hit the 4 boys like a physical blow, shattering whatever remaining hope they had harbored for administrative resolution or family intervention. Ryan Carter's strategic composure finally cracked completely as the reality of arrest and criminal prosecution became undeniable. "This will destroy everything," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of handcuffs being prepared. "College, career, family reputation, everything we've worked for is gone." Alex Wright's phone was secured in an evidence bag as Officer Williams began reading him his Miranda rights, the formal recitation serving as a stark reminder that their privileged status offered no protection against criminal law enforcement. His social media empire, built on documenting other people's humiliation, had become the instrument of his own legal destruction. Brandon Davis was still struggling with his panic attack, but Officer Chen's professional demeanor ensured that his rights were properly protected, even as his emotional state made coherent communication difficult. The irony of requiring police protection from the consequences of his own criminal behavior was lost on him in his current distressed condition. Ethan Miller, whose physical intimidation had been the cornerstone of their assault strategy, found himself completely helpless as handcuffs were applied to the wrists he had planned to use for sexual assault. His athletic scholarships and college recruitment would be meaningless once news of his arrest became public, destroying years of training and achievement in a single moment of criminal stupidity. As the 4 boys were led away in handcuffs, their expensive clothes disheveled and their faces streaked with tears, the transformation of the classroom dynamic was complete. The substitute teacher they had targeted for humiliation and assault stood beside law enforcement officers and prosecutors, her calm competence serving as a stark contrast to their emotional collapse. Their reign of terror over vulnerable staff members had ended not with administrative negotiation or family intervention, but with criminal arrest and the promise of serious legal consequences. DA Fletcher approached Lisa as the suspects were being processed, her expression mixing professional respect with personal admiration. "Ms. Johnson, your handling of this situation was exemplary. Your military training clearly prepared you not." just for the physical defense, but for the legal and procedural aspects of documenting and reporting criminal behavior. Cases like this are often difficult to prosecute because victims are too traumatized or intimidated to provide effective testimony. "Thank you, D.A. Fletcher," Lisa replied with quiet satisfaction. These boys needed to learn that actions have consequences and that wealth and privilege can't protect them from accountability when they choose to commit crimes. I hope this case sends a message to other potential predators that substitute teachers and temporary staff members are not easy targets for abuse. Badil. The message was already spreading throughout Maple Valley High School as news of the arrests reached students and faculty through the rapid communication networks that define modern educational environments. The 4 boys who had terrorized substitute teachers with apparent impunity were being led away in handcuffs, their criminal behavior finally exposed, and their protective privilege rendered powerless against federal law enforcement and prosecutorial determination. The quiet substitute teacher in the conservative dress had not only defended herself successfully, but had triggered a complete dismantling of the systematic abuse that had poisoned the school's culture for years. Her 30-second defensive response had initiated consequences that would ripple through the community for months and potentially years, transforming not just the immediate situation, but the entire institutional approach to accountability and justice. As the classroom finally emptied of law enforcement personnel and the 4 arrested students, Lisa began gathering her materials with the same calm efficiency she had brought to the day's lessons. Her goal of completing a quiet day of substitute teaching had been dramatically derailed, but the alternative outcome would serve the cause of justice and protection for future temporary staff members in ways that far exceeded her original modest objectives. The Springfield County Courthouse buzzed with unprecedented activity as media vans lined the parking lot and reporters jockeyed for position outside the main entrance. 3 weeks had passed since the arrests at Maple Valley High School, and the case that had begun with 4 boys attempting to humiliate a substitute teacher had evolved into a landmark prosecution that would reshape how educational institutions across the state handled harassment and accountability. Inside courtroom 3B, Lisa Johnson sat in the witness stand with the same composed dignity she had displayed during the original incident. Her testimony over the past 2 hours had been methodical, precise, and devastating to the defense's attempts to portray the assault as harmless teenage pranking. District Attorney Sarah Fletcher had guided her through every detail of the systematic harassment campaign, the coordinated isolation tactics, and the explicit sexual assault attempt that had triggered her defensive response. Judge Margaret Williams, a 20-year veteran of the bench, known for her no-nonsense approach to cases involving privileged defendants, had listened to the proceedings with obvious attention to both legal precedent and public interest implications. The courtroom gallery was packed with educators, parents, and community members, whose interest in the case extended far beyond its immediate participants. The defense table presented a stark contrast to the prosecution's confident professionalism. 4 separate attorneys, each representing one of the defendants, had spent the morning attempting to craft coherent strategies that could somehow minimize their client's culpability without contradicting the overwhelming video evidence. Ryan Carter's lawyer, Marcus Henderson, a senior partner at Springfield's most prestigious firm, had built his reputation on protecting wealthy clients from consequences. But even his considerable skills were proving inadequate against the documented criminal behavior. "Your Honor," Henderson began during his cross-examination of Lisa, "while we don't condone the inappropriate behavior exhibited by these young men, we must consider whether Ms. Johnson's response was proportionate to the actual threat she faced. Her extensive military combat training gave her significant advantages over these students, and we question whether a trained killer was truly in danger from unarmed teenagers. Lisa's response was immediate and unwavering. "Mr. Henderson, I'm not a killer. I'm a combat veteran trained in defensive techniques designed to protect myself and others from assault." When Mr. Miller reached for my clothing with clear sexual intent while his accomplices blocked my exits and recorded the assault, I used precisely the minimum force necessary to stop the attack and protect myself from further harm. Judge Williams intervened before Henderson could continue his line of questioning. "Counselor, the defendant's military service is a qualification, not a liability. This court will not tolerate any attempt to suggest that combat veterans are somehow disqualified from defending themselves against sexual assault. Your client's age and educational status do not grant him immunity from criminal prosecution for attempted rape." The judicial rebuke sent visible ripples through the defense team, as they realized that their strategy of portraying Lisa as an overly aggressive responder was backfiring spectacularly. The judge's clear support for Lisa's actions reinforced the prosecution's narrative that the defendants had chosen their victim poorly and faced appropriate consequences for their criminal behavior. Ethan Miller's attorney, Rebecca Torres, attempted a different approach during her questioning. "Ms. Johnson, my client maintains that this entire incident was a misunderstanding that escalated due to poor communication. Isn't it possible that what you interpreted as sexual assault was actually just awkward teenage behavior that crossed boundaries without malicious intent?" Lisa's answer demolished this line of defense with surgical precision. "Ms. Torres, your client explicitly stated his intention to see what I was wearing under my dress while positioning himself to lift my clothing without consent. His accomplices coordinated to isolate me from help and record my humiliation. These were not accidental boundary crossings, but deliberate acts of sexual assault planned and executed with sophisticated coordination." The video evidence, played multiple times throughout the trial, had proven to be the prosecution's most powerful weapon. Alex Wright's own recording captured not only the assault attempt, but also the boys' explicit statements of intent, their coordination of positions, and their dismissal of other students to ensure privacy for their planned attack. What had been intended as evidence of Lisa's humiliation had become irrefutable documentation of their criminal conspiracy. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a forensic psychologist called by the prosecution, had testified extensively about the psychological patterns evident in the defendant's behavior. "This was not impulsive teenage misbehavior," she explained to the jury. "The systematic harassment campaign, the deliberate targeting of substitute teachers, and the coordinated assault attempt demonstrate sophisticated predatory behavior that poses ongoing risks to potential future victims." Her expert testimony had been particularly damaging because it established the defendants not as confused adolescents, but as calculating predators who had refined their techniques through practice on previous victims. The prosecution had located 3 former substitute teachers who testified about similar harassment campaigns, creating a pattern that eliminated any possibility of portraying the assault attempt as an isolated incident. Brandon Davis's mother, Catherine Davis, had created additional complications for the defense by attempting to use her husband's political connections to influence the prosecution. Her ham-fisted efforts to pressure DA Fletcher through city council channels had backfired spectacularly, resulting in additional public scrutiny and ethical complaints that further damaged her family's reputation. The entitled behavior that had enabled her son's criminal conduct was now being displayed publicly by his mother. Alex Wright's social media empire had collapsed entirely once news of his arrest became public. His followers had abandoned him in droves as the video evidence of his participation in attempted sexual assault circulated widely. Corporate sponsors had terminated their relationships immediately, and his college acceptance letters had been rescinded. The platform he had built on documenting other people's humiliation had become the instrument of his own complete social destruction. The community impact of the case extended far beyond the 4 defendants and their families. Maple Valley High. School had been forced to implement comprehensive policy reforms addressing harassment, accountability, and the protection of temporary staff members. Principal Anderson had been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation of his handling of previous complaints, and several school board members faced recall elections driven by parents outraged at the systematic protection of predatory behavior. Detective Martinez had testified about the broader investigation that had emerged from the original incident. What we discovered was essentially an institutional culture that enabled systematic abuse of substitute teachers and other vulnerable staff members, he explained to the jury. These 4 defendants were not operating in isolation, but as part of a protected system that prioritized donor relationships over student and staff safety. The financial costs to the defendants' families had already reached devastating levels even before the trial's conclusion. Legal fees, public relations consultants, and settlement discussions with previous victims had consumed hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ryan Carter's father had been forced to resign from the school board under public pressure, while his construction company faced boycotts from clients who refused to support businesses associated with sexual predators. Ethan Miller's athletic scholarships had been revoked immediately upon his arrest, ending dreams of professional sports career that had defined his identity since childhood. College recruitment letters had been replaced with legal documents as universities distanced themselves from association with his criminal behavior. His parents faced the additional burden of explaining their son's actions to younger siblings, whose own educational and social opportunities were being affected by his crimes. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by DA Fletcher herself, tied together all elements of the case into a compelling narrative of accountability and justice. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case represents more than just one incident of attempted sexual assault. It represents the choice between a society that protects predators because of their wealth and privilege, or a society that holds all citizens accountable for their criminal behavior regardless of their family connections. She continued with obvious passion for the broader implications of the case. Ms. Johnson's courage in defending herself and pursuing justice has exposed a systematic pattern of abuse that had been allowed to flourish because victims were considered expendable and perpetrators were considered untouchable. Your verdict will determine whether that system continues or whether justice applies equally to all members of our community. The defense's closing arguments had been notably brief and lacking in conviction. Each attorney had attempted to minimize their client's individual culpability while acknowledging that mistakes had been made. Ryan Carter's lawyer had focused on his client's academic achievements and family contributions to the community. Ethan, Miller's attorney, had emphasized his athletic accomplishments and college potential. Alex Wright's representative had cited his youth and social media influence as evidence of poor judgment rather than criminal intent. Brandon Davis's counsel had stressed his family's political involvement and community service. None of these character references had addressed the fundamental issue of criminal assault, and the jury's body language throughout the closing arguments suggested that academic and athletic achievements were irrelevant to questions of legal accountability. The video evidence had created an evidentiary foundation that no amount of character testimony could overcome. Judge Williams' instructions to the jury had been clear and comprehensive, emphasizing that wealth, family connections, and academic achievement were not legal defenses to criminal charges. You must evaluate this case based solely on the evidence presented and the applicable law, she instructed. The defendant's social status, their family's community involvement, and their previous accomplishments are not relevant to determining their guilt or innocence regarding the charges they face. The jury deliberation lasted only 4 hours, an unusually brief period for a case involving multiple defendants and complex conspiracy charges. When they returned to the courtroom, their expressions suggested that the evidence had been overwhelming and the decision straightforward. The foreman, a retired teacher who understood the dynamics of educational environments, delivered the verdicts with obvious satisfaction. On the charge of conspiracy to commit sexual assault in the first degree, we find the defendant Ryan Carter guilty. On the charge of attempted sexual assault in the first degree, we find the defendant Ethan Miller guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit sexual assault and evidence tampering, we find the defendant Alex Wright guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit sexual assault and intimidation, we find the defendant Brandon Davis guilty. The guilty verdicts on all major charges sent shockwaves through the courtroom gallery as the reality of criminal conviction settled over the defendants and their families. Ryan Carter collapsed into his chair, the strategic mind that had orchestrated so many successful harassment campaigns, finally overwhelmed by consequences he had never anticipated. Ethan Miller began sobbing uncontrollably, his physical strength useless against the weight of criminal conviction and destroyed future prospects. Alex Wright stared at his hands in stunned silence as he contemplated the complete destruction of everything he had built through social media influence and online networking. Brandon Davis hyperventilated once again, his panic attacks returning as the full scope of his criminal conviction and its impact on his family's political aspirations became undeniable. Judge Williams scheduled sentencing for the following month, but she addressed the defendants directly before concluding the trial proceedings. Young men, you have been convicted of serious felony charges that will affect the rest of your lives. You targeted someone you perceived as vulnerable and powerless, but you discovered that real strength comes from character and training rather than inherited privilege. I hope you use your remaining time before sentencing to reflect on the harm you've caused and the changes you need to make. The sentencing hearing 4 weeks later drew even larger crowds as community interest in the case had continued to grow. Lisa Johnson was present to deliver a victim impact statement that focused not on personal vindictiveness, but on the broader implications for educational safety and institutional accountability. Your Honor, these 4 young men attempted to sexually assault me because they believed their wealth and privilege made them untouchable, she stated with quiet dignity. Their conviction sends a message that no one is above the law and that victims have both the right and the ability to defend themselves effectively. I hope their punishment includes elements that will help them become productive members of society, while ensuring they never again pose a threat to vulnerable individuals. Judge Williams imposed sentences that balance punishment with rehabilitation while ensuring community safety. Ryan Carter received 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, along with mandatory counseling and community service requirements. Ethan Miller was sentenced to 2.5 years imprisonment with similar probation and treatment conditions. Alex Wright and Brandon Davis each received 2 years incarceration with extended probation periods that included restrictions on social media use and political activity, All 4 defendants were required to register as sex offenders, a designation that would follow them for decades and severely limit their housing, employment, and educational opportunities. The financial restitution orders included payments to Lisa for legal expenses and emotional distress, as well as contributions to victim advocacy organizations and educational safety programs. The institutional changes triggered by the case extended far beyond Maple Valley High School to encompass district-wide policy reforms and state-level legislative initiatives. The Lisa Johnson Act, passed by the state legislature 6 months after the trial, established comprehensive protections for substitute teachers and temporary educational staff, along with mandatory reporting requirements for harassment incidents and whistleblower protections for those who reported institutional cover-ups. Lisa herself had used the public attention generated by the case to launch a non-profit organization focused on educational safety and self-defense training for vulnerable workers. Her military background and practical experience with crisis management made her a sought-after speaker at conferences and training sessions across the country. The substitute teacher, who had simply wanted to complete a quiet day of work, had become a national advocate for workplace safety and victim empowerment. The 4 families, whose wealth and influence had once protected their sons from consequences, faced ongoing social and financial repercussions that extended far beyond the criminal proceedings. Ryan Carter's father lost multiple business contracts as clients distanced themselves from association with convicted sex offenders. Ethan Miller's family relocated to another state to escape the social stigma that made normal community interaction impossible. Alex Wright's parents faced bankruptcy as legal fees and civil settlements consumed their accumulated wealth. Brandon Davis's father abandoned his political ambitions permanently, recognizing that his son's criminal conviction had made any future campaigns impossible. The family's real estate business suffered massive losses as both clients and partners refused to maintain relationships with people associated with sexual predators. The social protection that had once seemed permanent and unshakable had evaporated completely once criminal behavior was exposed and prosecuted. The transformation of Maple Valley High School's culture was perhaps the most lasting legacy of the case. The systematic harassment and intimidation that had plagued substitute teachers and temporary staff members ended immediately as students realized that criminal behavior would result in serious legal consequences regardless of family connections. A new generation of administrators, hired specifically for their commitment to accountability and safety, implemented programs that prioritized victim protection over donor relations. 3 years after the initial incident, Lisa Johnson returned to Maple Valley High School as a guest speaker during National Crime Victims' Rights Week. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and community members who gathered to hear her story and its lessons about courage, accountability, and justice. Her message emphasized that individual acts of resistance could create systemic change when supported by institutional commitment to equality under law. The 4 young men who attempted to assault me believed that substitute teachers were easy and targets who could be abused without consequence, she told the assembled audience. They learned that real strength comes from preparation, training, and moral courage rather than inherited privilege. Your generation has the opportunity to build educational environments where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their temporary status or social position. The standing ovation that followed her presentation lasted several minutes, reflecting not just appreciation for her individual courage, but recognition of the broader transformation her actions had initiated. The quiet substitute teacher who had defended herself in a biology classroom had become a symbol of resistance against institutional indifference and privileged impunity. The 4 convicted defendants, now serving their sentences in different Correctional facilities faced daily reminders that their actions had consequences extending far beyond their immediate punishment. Prison environments offered harsh lessons in power dynamics to young men who had never previously faced genuine accountability for their behavior. Their wealthy backgrounds provided no protection against institutional reality, and their previous sense of entitlement was systematically dismantled through experience with actual powerlessness. Ryan Carter, once the strategic leader of harassment campaigns, spent his incarceration in mandatory counseling sessions designed to address the psychological patterns that had enabled his predatory behavior. His intelligence, previously directed toward exploitation and manipulation, was gradually redirected toward understanding the harm he had caused and developing empathy for his victims. The transformation was slow and often painful, but correctional. Professionals noted genuine progress in his ability to accept responsibility and express remorse. Ethan Miller's athletic abilities were irrelevant in prison environments where physical intimidation was met with institutional consequences rather than administrative protection. His identity, previously built entirely around sports achievement and physical dominance, required complete reconstruction around values of respect and cooperation. The process was particularly difficult for someone whose entire self-concept had been based on superiority over others. Alex Wright faced the additional challenge of complete social media prohibition as part of his sentence conditions. The digital platforms that had defined his identity and provided his sense of purpose were permanently inaccessible, forcing him to develop real-world social skills and genuine human connections. His previous expertise in documenting other people's humiliation became a source of deep shame as he experienced genuine remorse for the pain he had caused. Brandon Davis's family's political connections, once a source of protection and privilege, became liabilities that complicated his reintegration planning. His father's abandoned political career served as a constant reminder of the broader consequences of his criminal behavior, motivating genuine efforts toward rehabilitation and community service that might partially repair the damage his actions had caused. The broader community continued to benefit from the institutional changes initiated by Lisa's courageous stand against predatory behavior. Substitute teachers throughout the district reported dramatically improved working conditions and increased respect from both students and administrators. The message that temporary staff members deserved protection and dignity had been established permanently through criminal prosecution and institutional reform. Educational conferences across the nation featured presentations about the Maple Valley case as a model for addressing systemic harassment and institutional accountability. Lisa's documentation techniques, defensive strategies, and legal advocacy approaches became standard curriculum in teacher preparation programs. Her example inspired countless educators to report misconduct and demand institutional support rather than accepting abuse as an inevitable aspect of substitute teaching. The case also influenced broader discussions about privilege, accountability, and justice in American society. Legal scholars analyzed the prosecution as a breakthrough example of holding wealthy defendants accountable for predatory behavior that had previously been protected through institutional indifference and social connections. The video evidence and military credibility that had made Lisa's case so compelling became templates for other victims seeking justice against privileged predators. As the 5th anniversary of the incident approached, Lisa Johnson reflected on the unexpected trajectory her life had taken from that morning when she had simply intended to complete a routine substitute teaching assignment. The 30 seconds of defensive action that had protected her from sexual assault had initiated changes that continued to protect countless other vulnerable workers from similar predatory behavior. the 4 young men who had attempted to humiliate and assault her had instead become examples of how privilege and wealth could not protect criminals from accountability when their victims possessed the courage, skills, and determination to fight back effectively. Their convictions served as permanent reminders that justice could prevail over institutional indifference when individual courage was supported by professional competence and community determination. The substitute teacher's secret had been revealed not as weakness or vulnerability, but as the strength that comes from preparation, training, and unwavering commitment to justice. Her story continued to inspire others facing similar challenges, while serving as a warning to potential predators that their intended victims might possess resources and capabilities far beyond their assumptions and expectations. 10 years had passed since the biology classroom confrontation that transformed not only 4 young lives, but an entire educational system's approach to safety and accountability. The anniversary arrived on a crisp autumn morning in Springfield, Ohio, where the leaves were just beginning to turn golden around the Maple Valley High School campus that now bore little resemblance to the institution where privilege had once protected predators from consequences. Dr. Lisa Johnson Martinez stepped out of her hybrid sedan in the faculty parking lot, her credentials now including a doctorate in educational psychology and a position as director of the National Center for Educational Safety. The same woman who had once driven a weathered Toyota Corolla to substitute teaching assignments now served as a consultant to school districts across the nation, helping administrators develop policies that protected vulnerable staff members while maintaining educational excellence. The school building itself had undergone significant renovations, funded ironically by settlements from the families of the convicted students whose criminal behavior had exposed the institution's systemic failures. Where once expensive cars had dominated the student parking lot as symbols of inherited privilege, a more diverse mix of vehicles now reflected the demographic changes that had accompanied the cultural transformation. The new administration had actively recruited students from various socioeconomic backgrounds, creating an environment where merit rather than family wealth determined social status. Principal Elena Rodriguez, who had replaced the dismissed Principal Anderson 5 years earlier, greeted Lisa at the main entrance with genuine warmth and professional respect. Rodriguez had been specifically selected for her experience in educational reform and her commitment to creating inclusive environments where all staff members, regardless of their employment status, received equal protection and respect. Dr. Johnson Martinez, welcome back to Maple Valley, Rodriguez said as they walked through hallways lined with academic achievement displays that now included recognition for teachers, support staff, and substitute educators alongside student accomplishments. The students are incredibly excited about your presentation today. Many of them have heard stories about what happened here, but they've never had the opportunity to hear directly from you about the experience and its aftermath. The commemorative assembly had been organized not as a celebration of violence or conflict, but as an educational opportunity to discuss the importance of institutional accountability, personal courage, and the ongoing work required to maintain safe educational environments. The student body now included young people whose parents had specifically chosen Maple Valley because of its reputation for protecting all members of its community, rather than prioritizing the interests of wealthy donors. As they toured the renovated campus, Lisa noticed the subtle but significant changes that reflected the institution's new values. Security cameras were positioned openly rather than hidden, sending a clear message that behavior was monitored and accountability was expected. Anonymous reporting systems allowed students and staff to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Most importantly, clear policies were posted prominently, outlining zero-tolerance approaches to harassment, discrimination, and abuse of authority. The biology classroom where the original incident had occurred had been transformed into the Johnson-Martinez Center for Educational Ethics, a space dedicated to ongoing professional development and conflict resolution training. The room now hosted regular workshops for educators, administrators, and students on topics ranging from bystander intervention to recognizing signs of predatory behavior. The irony that a space once used for attempted sexual assault had become a center for prevention education was not lost on anyone involved in the transformation. We've had over 2,000 educators participate in training programs here, Rodriguez explained as they entered the center. Your documentation techniques and crisis response protocols have become standard curriculum in teacher preparation programs throughout the region. The impact extends far beyond our individual campus to influence educational safety practices across multiple states. Lisa examined the displays that chronicled not only her case, but also the broader movement for educational safety reform that had emerged from the Springfield incident. Photos showed legislative hearings where she had testified about the need for comprehensive protections. Documents outlined policy changes that had been implemented in hundreds of school districts. Most meaningfully, testimonials from substitute teachers and temporary staff members described how the reforms had improved their working conditions and professional security. The centerpiece of the display was a video installation featuring interviews with educators who had benefited from the institutional changes. A young substitute teacher from Ohio described how clear reporting procedures had helped her address harassment before it escalated to criminal behavior. A temporary administrator from California explained how enhanced security measures had allowed her to focus on educational excellence rather than personal safety concerns. An elderly substitute from Texas shared how respect and protection policies had enabled her to continue contributing to education despite her vulnerability as an aging temporary worker. Dr. Michael Chen, now the district's superintendent of educational safety, joined them in the center to provide updates on the ongoing research and development programs that had emerged from the original incident. Chen had been recruited specifically to institutionalize the reforms and ensure that the lessons learned from the Maple Valley case continued to inform educational policy development at local, state, and national levels. Dr. Johnson-Martinez: We've documented a 97% reduction in reported harassment incidents involving temporary staff members across all schools in our district, Chen reported with obvious satisfaction. More importantly, we've seen significant increases in job satisfaction and retention rates among substitute teachers, which has improved educational continuity for our students. The investment in safety and respect has generated measurable returns in educational quality. The statistical improvements reflected broader changes in educational culture that extended beyond simple policy compliance to encompass genuine shifts in attitudes and expectations. Students now understood that disrespectful behavior toward any staff member, regardless of their employment status, would result in immediate and serious consequences. Parents recognized that the school's commitment to protecting all employees demonstrated institutional values that would benefit their children's education and character development. As they prepared for the assembly, Lisa reflected on the unexpected trajectory her career had taken since that October morning when she had simply intended to complete a routine substitute teaching assignment. Her non-profit organization, the Educational Safety Institute, now operated programs in 43 states and had trained over 50,000 educators in defensive techniques, documentation procedures, and institutional advocacy strategies. What had begun as personal survival had evolved into a national movement for workplace safety and dignity. The auditorium was packed with students, faculty, community members, and educational professionals who had traveled from across the region to attend the anniversary presentation. Unlike the tense atmosphere that had characterized her previous appearance at Maple Valley, this gathering reflected genuine interest in learning from historical events to improve current and future educational environments. Lisa's presentation began with a comprehensive overview of the systemic issues that had enabled predatory behavior to flourish in educational settings. She described how institutional priorities that favored wealthy donors over staff safety had created environments where harassment could escalate to criminal assault without meaningful intervention. Her analysis was scholarly but accessible, helping audience members understand the complex factors that had contributed to the original incident. "The 4 young men who attempted to assault me were not acting in isolation," she explained to the attentive audience. "They were products of a system that had taught them through consistent experience that their wealth and family connections made them immune to consequences for their actions. Their behavior was predictable, given the institutional environment that had shaped their expectations about power and accountability." She continued with detailed descriptions of the documentation techniques that had proven crucial to achieving justice and institutional reform. Her systematic approach to recording harassment incidents, gathering evidence, and navigating legal procedures had become a model for other victims seeking accountability for institutional failures and criminal behavior. Documentation is not just about building legal cases, Lisa emphasized. It's about creating undeniable records that force institutions to confront problems they might prefer to ignore. When harassment is carefully documented and properly reported, it becomes much more difficult for administrators to dismiss legitimate concerns or protect problematic individuals through institutional influence. The presentation included substantial discussion of the defensive techniques that had enabled her to protect herself during the assault attempt. However, Lisa was careful to emphasize that physical self-defense was only one component of a comprehensive safety strategy that included situational awareness, environmental assessment, and institutional advocacy. Her military training had provided advantages that most educators would not possess, making institutional protections even more critical for typical staff members. A significant portion of her presentation focused on the broader institutional changes that had emerged from the Springfield case and its aftermath. The legislative reforms, policy developments, and cultural shifts that had improved educational safety represented collaborative efforts involving thousands of educators, administrators, community members, and legal professionals who had recognized the need for systematic change. Individual courage is necessary, but not sufficient for creating lasting improvements in educational safety, Lisa explained. Real progress requires institutional commitment, community support, and ongoing vigilance to ensure that reforms are implemented effectively and maintained consistently. The changes at Maple Valley represent what's possible when an entire community commits to prioritizing safety and accountability over convenience and tradition. During the question and answer session that followed her formal presentation, students asked thoughtful questions about conflict resolution, bystander intervention, and personal safety strategies. Their inquiries reflected genuine interest in understanding how to create and maintain respectful environments, rather than simply avoiding consequences for disrespectful behavior. One senior student asked about the long-term outcomes for the 4 convicted individuals, a question that allowed Lisa to discuss rehabilitation, accountability, and the possibility of redemption even after serious criminal behavior. Her response balanced recognition of genuine harm with acknowledgement that people could change and contribute positively to society given appropriate consequences and support systems. Ryan Carter completed his sentence and has spent the past 5 years working with victim advocacy organizations and educational safety programs, Lisa reported. His experience with criminal prosecution and incarceration gave him insights into institutional power dynamics that he now uses to help other young people understand the importance of respecting boundaries and accepting accountability. His transformation has been genuine and substantial, though it will never erase the harm he caused to his victims. She provided similar updates on the other 3 former defendants, describing their various paths toward rehabilitation and community service. Ethan Miller had become a counselor for at-risk youth, using his experience with the consequences of privileged entitlement to help others avoid similar mistakes. Alex Wright had abandoned social media influence in favor of non-profit work focused on digital literacy and online safety education. Brandon Davis had dedicated himself to political reform efforts aimed at increasing government transparency and reducing corruption. Their stories demonstrate that criminal behavior can have devastating consequences, while also providing opportunities for growth and positive contribution, Lisa explained. Accountability and rehabilitation are not contradictory goals, but complementary. Aspects of a justice system that prioritizes both protection for victims and transformation for offenders. The assembly concluded with a panel discussion featuring current substitute teachers, temporary staff members, and administrators who shared their experiences with the reformed policies and procedures that had emerged from the original incident. Their testimonials provided concrete evidence that institutional changes had created measurable improvements in working conditions, job satisfaction, and educational quality. Maria Gonzalez, a substitute teacher with 15 years of experience, described how the enhanced protection policies had transformed her professional experience. Before the reforms, substitute teaching felt like entering hostile territory where you had to survive until the regular teacher returned, she explained. Now I feel like a valued member of the educational team with clear support systems and established procedures for addressing any problems that might arise. James Patterson, a retired police officer who now worked as a substitute security coordinator, discussed how the institutional changes had influenced his decision to enter education. The administration's commitment to safety and accountability attracted me to this district, he said. I wanted to contribute to an environment where all staff members, regardless of their employment status, could focus on education rather than personal protection. Dr. Amanda Foster, who served as the district's director of substitute services, provided statistical evidence of the program's success in recruiting and retaining high-quality temporary staff. We've seen a 340% increase in substitute teacher applications since implementing the safety reforms, she reported. More importantly, we've dramatically improved educational continuity because qualified substitutes are willing to return repeatedly to schools where they feel respected and protected. The afternoon session included workshops where participants could learn specific techniques for documentation, reporting, and advocacy that had proven effective in addressing educational safety concerns. Lisa personally conducted training sessions on situational awareness, emergency communication, and basic defensive strategies that could be adapted for various educational environments and personal capabilities. The Defensive Tactics Workshop drew particular interest from educators who recognized that while institutional protections were essential, individual preparedness remained an important component of comprehensive safety planning. Lisa's instruction emphasized techniques that were practical for people of varying physical capabilities and could be implemented without specialized equipment or extensive training. The goal is not to turn educators into combatants, but to provide basic skills that could help you protect yourself and others in emergency situations, she explained, while demonstrating simple escape techniques and distraction methods. Most importantly, these skills can increase your confidence and situational awareness, which often prevent problems from escalating to the point where physical intervention becomes necessary. The psychological aspects of harassment and assault prevention received equal attention during the afternoon workshops. Licensed counselors and social workers led discussions about recognizing early warning signs of predatory behavior, understanding power dynamics that enable abuse, and developing personal resilience strategies that support long-term professional sustainability in challenging environments. Dr. Rachel Kim, a forensic psychologist who had been involved in the original investigation, provided insights into the psychological profiles of individuals who target vulnerable populations. Predators typically select victims they perceive as isolated, powerless, and unlikely to report or resist their advances, she explained. Understanding these selection criteria can help potential targets modify their behavior and environment to reduce their vulnerability while building support networks that discourage predatory approaches. The workshop sessions also addressed the importance of community engagement and institutional advocacy in maintaining educational safety improvements. Participants learned about legislative processes, school board procedures, and community organizing, strategies that could be used to support ongoing reforms and resist attempts to roll back protective policies. Institutional change requires constant maintenance and advocacy, Lisa emphasized during the final workshop session. Progress can be reversed quickly if communities become complacent or if institutional leadership changes without proper transition planning. Everyone who benefits from these reforms has a responsibility to support their continuation and expansion. The day concluded with a community dinner that brought together current and former staff members, students, parents, and community leaders who had contributed to the transformation of Maple Valley High School and the broader educational safety movement. The event served both as a celebration of progress achieved and as a planning session for future initiatives aimed at expanding protective reforms to additional educational environments. During the dinner, Lisa was presented with the district's first ever Distinguished Service Award, recognizing her role in initiating reforms that had improved educational safety for thousands of students and staff members. The award citation specifically acknowledged her courage in defending herself, her persistence in pursuing justice, and her ongoing commitment to helping other educators develop similar capabilities for self-protection and institutional advocacy. Dr. Johnson Martinez, your actions 10 years ago changed not just our school, but our entire understanding of what educational safety requires, Principal Rodriguez said during the presentation ceremony. Your courage saved not only yourself, but countless other staff members who now work in environments where respect and protection are institutional priorities rather than personal responsibilities. The evening also featured the announcement of a new scholarship program funded by donations from community members who wanted to honor Lisa's contributions while supporting future educators committed to safety and excellence. The Johnson Martinez Educational Safety Scholarship would provide financial assistance to students preparing for careers in education, with preference given to those who demonstrated commitment to creating inclusive and protective learning environments. As the anniversary events concluded, Lisa reflected on the complex mixture of pride and sadness that accompanied such commemorations. The progress achieved was undeniable and substantial, but it had come at significant personal and professional costs for all involved. The four young men whose criminal behavior had initiated these changes had paid heavy prices for their actions, while their families had experienced social and financial consequences that extended far beyond the immediate. Legal proceedings. Change is possible, but it's rarely easy or painless, she observed during her closing remarks to the assembled community members. The reforms we're celebrating tonight emerged from conflict, suffering, and hard-won accountability rather than voluntary institutional evolution. Progress required external pressure, legal intervention, and sustained community advocacy to overcome entrenched systems that prioritized convenience over justice. Her final message emphasized the ongoing nature of the work required to maintain and expand educational safety reforms. What we've accomplished here in Springfield represents what's possible when communities commit to prioritizing protection over privilege, she said. But these achievements are not permanent or self-sustaining. They require constant vigilance, continued advocacy, and renewed commitment from each generation of educators, students, and community members. The drive home through the familiar streets of Springfield provided Lisa with opportunities to observe the broader community changes that had accompanied the educational reforms. Businesses now prominently displayed policies prohibiting harassment and discrimination. Community organizations had implemented training programs addressing consent, respect, and bystander intervention. Local government had enhanced ordinances, protecting vulnerable workers in various employment settings. The ripple effects of her 30-second defensive action had expanded far beyond the original biology classroom to influence community attitudes about accountability, privilege, and justice. What had begun as personal survival had evolved into a sustained movement for institutional reform that continued to generate positive changes years after the initial incident. As she reflected on the anniversary events and their significance, Lisa recognized that her story had become larger than her individual experience. It now served as a symbol of resistance against institutional indifference and a demonstration that courage, preparation, and persistence could overcome even well-established systems of privilege and protection. The four boys who had attempted to humiliate and assault her had instead become catalysts for transformative changes that protected countless other vulnerable individuals from similar predatory behavior. Their criminal actions had exposed institutional failures that might otherwise have continued indefinitely, enabling systematic abuse of temporary staff members and other powerless populations. The substitute teacher's secret had been revealed not as weakness or vulnerability, but as the strength that comes from preparation, training, and unwavering commitment to justice. Her story continued to inspire others facing similar challenges, while serving as a warning to potential predators that their intended victims might possess resources and capabilities far beyond their assumptions and expectations. The legacy of that October morning in the Maple Valley High School biology classroom would continue for generations, protecting educators and students who would never know the names of the individuals whose conflict had made their safety possible. The quiet woman who had simply wanted to complete a day of substitute teaching had become an enduring symbol of the principle that justice, when supported by courage and preparation, could triumph over privilege and institutional indifference. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.